I'm here to introduce my friend Jeff Millman, who models DNRGW, specifically the western slope of Cumbres Pass in the fall of 1941 in ON3. His layout is operational with buildings and scenery at early stages. Jeff has been an ON3 modeler for 40 years, modeling West Virginia logging in those earlier years. Jeff also has a mature standard gauge Western Maryland layout attached to that West Virginia ON3 logging line, but we'll forgive him for that. Jeff lives with his family in the village of Ayr, Ontario, which is about an hour from Toronto, and is an active member of the Maple Leaf Group for over 7 years now. So Jeff, over to you.
I called it Metamorphasis of a K27, or threading a silk purse from a sow's ear. Yeah, Jerry mentioned that I'm a long-time ON3 and O standard gauge modeler. 453 is the model that we'll go over tonight. So just sort of a hand sketch of the railroads in southwestern Colorado, and the part that I model is just in the very lower section here from Chama to Cumbres, the western slope of Cumbres Pass, fall of 1941. So this is basically the track plan for my layout. Goes from Chama to Cumbres, and I've got staging on both ends, so we can have different train movements entering and going over the pass. I model the falls so I can have stock trains, and really by 1941 the K27s were off the pass, but is it plausible that they could have been pressed into stock train service at that time? Yeah, maybe. So there's just an overview of the model that I'm presenting. Started off as precision scale mountain models K27 assemblies. I had a boiler and cab assembly and a tender lettered for 452, but they're actually correct for 453. And a mechanism with inside admission cylinders, which are incorrect for 453. But I did have an outside admission cylinder assembly shown on the lower right, which is the correct one for 453, and then just all the flotsam and jetsam of a scratch builder and kit basher. So pros of the MMI K27, they're comparatively inexpensive, readily available. They're well detailed with brass detail parts and cast white metal superstructures. Lots of prototypical locomotive variations, and the drive mechanism is just outstanding. The drive mechanism I had passed the glass plate test. In other words, take the motor off, take the worm gear off, and you can push it along a glass plate and it will freewheel. I've heard that there are some issues with the gearboxes on the first runs of K27s, but that wasn't an issue that I had. What are the cons of these models? They have very small motors, really too small for a locomotive that's this heavy. So you can see the motor in the lower left. The one on the left is the one I replaced. The replacement, the one on the right, is the original motor. It's just way underpowered. The window muntins are badly out of scale. They actually scale out as 4x4, so it's basically fence posts as window muntins. The tender superstructure is somewhat generic and a bit thick and clumpy, and as well the paint finish can be a bit on the thick side in general on these models. So just a little bit of overview on reference material. Oops, sorry. The mud hens, page 43, 44, and 45, show number 453 in the modeled configuration. Those photos were taken in 1942. 453 went through quite a few changes from the 30s to the 40s to the late 40s, but I'm modeling essentially the 1941 configuration. It operated in and around Durango at that time, so could it have been pressed into stock train service over Cumbres. Again, it's plausible. So let's get to work. Replacement of those cab windows. Thanks to Jerry Cornwell, he had a set of surplus to his needs hand-cut brass windows. So those with a bit of Dremel work and grinding and filing, the locomotive got a new set of cab windows. And what a huge improvement. If that's all you do to your MMI K27, you've transformed the model even at that level. Fitting in a bigger motor. The motor cavity really isn't a lot bigger than the stock motor, but fortunately there's quite a thickness of white metal around there. So if you get a good cutting burr, you can carve out a much larger motor cavity. So safety first, wear goggles, dust mask, and have a shop vac running to collect chips when you're doing this. Speaker and decoder. The Soundtrax Minicube speakers, a couple of those wired in series, fit very nicely within the cavity of the cast boiler, and there's room for a Soundtrax TSU 2200 steam decoder above that. Always nice when the steam engine sounds come out of the steam engine, so I was fortunate that they fit. This photo I titled "Ever Do a Project and Wish You'd Taken a Better Picture." Unfortunately, I didn't have a good picture of the drive mechanism modifications, and I didn't really want to take the engine apart to get one, but you can see in the photo, kind of going from left to right, the larger Northwest Shortline motor. I modified the motor mount bracket on the gearbox torque arm. Essentially took the original one and turned it around, and then fitted the outside admission cylinder assembly. Since they're all precision scale parts, it was basically a direct fit. Just take the old one off, put the new one on. So now the tender. The tender superstructure is nicely proportioned and detailed. There were many tender variants in the K27s. Essentially, each one of them was pretty much different. Around the top edge of the tender, the thickness of the casting is excessive. A little bit detracts from the look of the model overall. So I considered either grinding those edges down or remaking a new tender superstructure in styrene. In the end, what I ended up doing was getting a set of brass etchings. So shout out to my friend Stan Parsons, who passed this along to me. These are tender etchings salvaged from the Broadmoor hobby shop fire in the 1980s. So never throw anything out. It does have the correct square back corners for 453. The coal boards are the modified ones for 453, which are actually an after 1941 modification. So that was a slight compromise. So there's the tender superstructure put together. I did a clinic in November of 2021 on building and being a reluctant brass builder. So you can refer back to that to get some of the details and techniques for doing that type of construction. So I got it all put together, the model all done, and then I realized I forgot to add the brackets on the rear coal sheet, but nobody knows that except for me and you guys, so we'll be okay. The tender frame is pretty good. The re-rail frog really needs sorting out. It's not very representative. There are some excellent YouTube videos on soldering with white metal. The key is proper flux and use of low temperature solder. The MMI white metal, at least on this model, was very tenacious and needed a lot of heat to solder. That's not entirely usual. So I would, if you attempt something like this, try it on an inconspicuous part of the model. So there's the re-rail frog and hangers mounted, soldered in place. and the rear glad hand was missing, so I fixed that up at the same time. So there's the completed tender. And now just some notes about weathering. In terms of resources, Colorado Railroad Museum color calendars from the 1990s are an excellent source of weathering inspiration. They have color photographs as far back as 1939. The RGS story, lots of good color photographs in there of weathered locomotives. Volume 4, page 418, has a photo of 461 on the RGS in 1951. So that's actually the inspiration for the weathering job I did on this model. Another excellent resource, Rio Grande narrow gauge in color. Lots of really good photographs. So can't show you any of those because they're all copywritten material. So I'll show you my pictures. So this is 463 on the Cumbres and Toltec, taken at different times. What I was really going after was the weathered look of the front of the smoke box and the very heavy sooty look on the boiler. It's almost, the weathering has texture. There's a fuzz to it. And that's the same locomotive, different year. And you can see how the weathering changes with time, of course. And just a photo of the generator. You can see you start to get some of that really fuzzy weathering look, and which is what I was wanting to go after. And a lot of dirt kicked up on the boiler that surrounds the firebox, and a lot of dirt and grease on the running gear. Cab sides and tender sides tended to get wiped down from time to time, so weathering is not quite as heavy in those areas. And just typical running gear. So let me just do a shout out to Al Collins of Ultimation. Al is really my inspiration for a lot of these weathering materials, and talked to him quite a bit about weathering techniques. So there's really not much airbrushing on this model. Mostly I've used MIG weathering powders to get that fuzzy look, and pan pastels. I used oil brushers as kind of a base for the color. Mineral spirits are good for thinning and moving the oil brushers around, and for smooching the powders around. Once the weathering's all done, it's fairly delicate. It's easy to wipe off. So this AK ultra matte acrylic varnish was used as an overspray to kind of hold everything in place. Again, it's still a fairly delicate weathering job, but it's just powder. If it gets rubbed off, I can put more on. So here's a photo of the model with the weathering above the running boards. The touch points, being the cab sides, the roof, and the cylinder sides, the things you grab when you want to pick the locomotive up, are washed only with oil brushers and mineral spirits. That stuff's tenacious enough to hold up, but no powders in those areas. Other areas have the AK, or rather the MIG powders and pan pastels applied over the oil brusher. And usually a locomotive in hard service has quite a collection of cinders on the footboards. So those are actually Scenic Express fine cinders on the running boards. And just a view of the other side of the engine. Around the pump and the governor valve and generator, there's a little bit more lighter color, representing maybe some steam leakage. As my friend Peter says, just muck in and have fun. It's very much a trial and error process. Below the running boards, the side rods are coated with PBL Neolube dry film lubricant. You can get that at Micromark. Oil brushers were used to weather the cylinder sides, again, because they're high touch points, and the frame. AK, or rather MIG powders and pan pastels applied to the boiler side at the firebox. So rust and grime. So the tender body was entirely washed down with successive washes of oil brushers and mineral spirits. The tender frame is the only place where I got the airbrush out, simulating road grime that would get kicked up underneath the tender. And I have the airbrush at quite a low angle and run the tender through the airbrush. That way you don't get any shadows on the wheels. So MV lenses to round out the look. And yeah, just a photo of the coal load. Now, talking about power on board, just another shout out to my friend Keith Stamper. He's very much my mentor when it comes to power on board and walked me through my first power on board installation. So within the locomotive, the decoder and speaker are in there. In the tender, there's a air wire radio receiver, a Polo switch, and the battery. That leaves only 2 wires between the engine and the tender. I don't power the lights in my locomotive, just a personal choice, and that keeps the wiring simpler. So there's a photograph of the 2.5 amp air wire converter, just a radio receiver. Polo and reed switch. The reed switch is used to turn the locomotive on and off using a permanent magnet, just basically a wand. Pass a wand by the locomotive and it'll turn it on or turn it off. And the Polo switch manages charging and then on and off for operation. So it just eliminates a bunch of mini double pole, double throw switches. Mini plugs for wiring a locomotive. Of course, you can never have too many of those. And there's everything stuffed inside the tender. And the charging plug underneath the water hatch. Just a note about safety. If you do decide to do a battery-powered application, make sure that any plug that is live, or in other words, is connected to the battery, is a female plug starting from the battery and working outwards. A charged 800 milliamp hour lithium polymer battery has tremendous stored energy, so you really do have to be careful. Oops. And a simple little charger. This is one of a collection of chargers that I have. Very simple, and will charge up a dead locomotive in maybe an hour and a half. And air wire throttles, the T5000 or the T6000. Actually, the T5000 is obsolete now, but the T6000 is the one they're offering. Very nice throttles, very intuitive. And just some notes about power on board. If I were to do it all over again, I would use the Soundtrax Blunami. The Blunami replaces the TSU 2200 and eliminates the air wire converter and the air wire throttle. Your engine CVs can be set from an app on your iPad. No need for a DCC system or JMRI Decoder Pro. And your engine can be controlled from your iPhone or iPad. The other thing that I've found is the Bluetooth technology of the Blunami has significantly improved range compared to the AirWire radio controlled technology. But then, as they say, any technology is obsolete as soon as it's on the market. And just a few conclusions. I'm pleased with the overall results on the locomotive. The engine's an exceptionally good puller. I have 3% grades on my layout rather than the 4% prototype, and it can easily pull a 12-car stock train up a 3% grade. It's a reasonably accurate representation of 453 in the early 1940s. I think I've been able to address the shortcomings of the MMI K27 appearance. And I had fun with the weathering. It really was a trial and error duck in and muck in. The paint finish on the model wasn't brilliant to begin with, so I figured I couldn't hurt it because otherwise I would have had to strip the engine down and repaint it anyway. So that was fun. Any questions?
Thanks, Jeff. We do have a couple of questions and comments. The first question is from Greg Wright. He's asking, what are oil brushers?
Oh, it's a, let me just go back to that. They are a MIG product. So if you get into a hobby store that does military modeling and has all the military modeling paints, they're basically a pre-thinned oil paint. They are, you know, rather than being the paste in a tube, they're pre-thinned. You take the cap off and it's got a brush inside of it that you can applique. The oil paint doesn't dry very quickly. It takes about a week and a half to fully cure. So you can weather like crazy. If you come back the next day and you don't like what you see, you take some mineral spirits and just clean it all off and start over again. But once it dries, it dries like a tenacious oil paint. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I've been using that too. You really need the mineral spirits to work with it, I find. Yeah, I found it really. I haven't got to the point where I'm as good at as Jeff is at it, but it's a neat product. Available in a whole series of colors, but there are lots of nice rust and grime colors.
They even have spaceship grime.
Oh, perfect. I'll think of that. Jim Brown says, really nice but subtle weathering, reflecting a well-used locomotive. Brian Bass's comment, air wire will change your life. Bill Hobbs is saying, I'm looking forward to test the Blue Nami when the software for Android is finally available. I know that's been something people are waiting for. Brian Bass says, beautiful work. Jim Spice says, great looking engine. And Brian Bass comes back with say, can we see the tender coal photo again? It was great.
Oh, sure. Oh,
right there. Yeah, that's really impressive shot. And with the coaling station, coaling tower on the right-hand side, of course. That's brilliant. And Johnny Everett says, hey, Jeff. I'm not going to try and simulate a South African accent. Excellent weathering and detailing, mate.